Every civilization has a beginning, a moment before which there is nothing, no writing, no cities, no kings, no record, and a moment after which history begins, gradually at first, then with increasing clarity. For ancient Egypt, that moment of beginning is Abydos, not Cairo, not Giza, not Luxor or Memphis or Alexandria. Abydos, a city on the edge of the western desert, in the middle of Egypt, that most tourists never visit, and most history books mention only in passing, as the location of some royal tombs, as a religious center, as the site of the Osirian. But Abydos is more than that. Abydos is where Egyptian civilization appears to have begun, where the earliest kings were buried, where the first hieroglyphs were written, where the oldest royal tombs in Egypt were found, where, beneath the sand, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of a civilization that should not yet have been capable of what it was doing, and where, buried in a pit that no ancient text describes and no ancient record explains, 14 wooden boats were found, each one over 18 meters long, each one sealed in its own mud brick enclosure, each one placed in the desert sand over 5,000 years ago, for reasons that nobody has satisfactorily explained. Abydos is where history begins, and it is where the history we think we know begins to come apart. In 1988, an American archaeologist named David O'Connor was excavating at Abydos when his team found something unexpected. Buried in the desert sand, arranged in a row, were 12 mud brick enclosures. Long, narrow, rectangular structures, sealed and buried, stretching away from the main tomb complex of the earliest Egyptian kings. Each enclosure was roughly 20 meters long and slightly over 2 meters wide. Inside each enclosure was a boat, a wooden boat, preserved by the dryness of the desert, its hull still largely intact after more than 5,000 years. The boats were not small ceremonial objects. They were full-sized vessels, each one between 18 and 21 meters long, wide enough for a crew, built to the specifications of actual working boats. 2 more enclosures were found in subsequent excavations, bringing the total to 14. 14 boats, buried in a row, in the desert, next to the tombs of Egypt's earliest kings. The conventional explanation is that the boats were symbolic, that they were placed there to carry the dead pharaoh on his journey through the afterlife, specifically on the solar bark that Egyptian mythology described as the vessel of the sun, god Ra, sailing through the underworld each night. This explanation is consistent with what we know about Egyptian religious belief. Boat burials are documented at other sites. The symbolism of the solar bark is well established. But the explanation has a problem. If these boats were purely symbolic, if their purpose was religious rather than practical, then why are they full-sized, seaworthy vessels, built to specifications consistent with actual use? Egyptian religious symbolism did not typically require functional objects. Shabbat figurines, placed in tombs to serve the dead in the afterlife, are small. Model boats found in tombs are miniatures. The objects placed in royal burials to serve symbolic functions are generally not the same as the functional objects they represent. These boats are functional. They could be launched. They could sail. Why would a pharaoh bury 14 functioning boats in the desert? What were they for? And who, before the pharaohs, might have used them? Before the pharaohs, there were the kings before the kings. This is not mythology. This is archaeology. In the royal cemetery at Abydos, known as el Ka'ab, which translates as Mother of Pots, because of the vast quantity of pottery sherds scattered across it. There are tombs that predate Dynasty I. Predate the first pharaoh Narmer, whose palette commemorating the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt is one of the most famous objects in Egyptian history. Predate the beginning of what we call Egyptian civilization. These tombs belong to rulers who are now labeled Dynasty 0, a designation that was invented because there was no room for them in the conventional framework of Egyptian history, which begins with Dynasty 1. Dynasty 0 is not a proper dynasty in the conventional sense. It is a collection of rulers whose names appear on tomb labels, on ceramics carved in stone, on objects found in burials that predate the formal beginning of the Egyptian state. The artifacts found in these tombs are the first problem. They are too sophisticated. The pottery is well made, not the crude, hand-formed vessels you would expect from a civilization at the earliest stages of ceramic technology, but wheel-thrown, kiln-fired vessels of consistent quality. The carved ivory objects show a mastery of the material that implies a long tradition of practice. The stone vessels, bowls and jars carved from hard stones, including granite, diorite, and basalt, are made to tolerances that imply skilled craftsmen working in an established tradition. And most significantly, the writing. The earliest hieroglyphs in the archaeological record come from Abydos. They appear on small labels, carved in bone and ivory, found in the Dynasty 0 tombs. They are not proto-writing, not pictograms evolving toward a script. They are hieroglyphs, a fully formed writing system, with phonetic elements, with grammatical structure, with the capacity to record complex information. They appear, essentially, fully formed. This is not how writing systems develop. Writing systems develop slowly. They begin as pictograms, simple representations of objects. They evolve gradually toward more abstract forms, incorporating phonetic elements over centuries of use. The development of writing from its earliest stages to a fully functional script takes, historically, hundreds of years. The hieroglyphs at Abydos appear without this developmental sequence. They are already a writing system when we first find them, which means either the developmental sequence happened somewhere else, and the record of it has not been found, or the system was transmitted, fully formed, from a source that predates the Dynasty 0 tombs, a source we have not identified, a civilization we have not found. Here is what the standard model of ancient Egypt tells us about how Egyptian civilization began. Around 3200 BC, the scattered agricultural communities of the Nile Valley began to coalesce into larger political units. Competition and conflict between Upper and Lower Egypt eventually led to unification under a single ruler. The administrative demands of running a unified state drove the development of writing, which appeared rapidly around the time of unification. The early kings of Dynasty I established the template for 3,000 years of pharaonic civilization. This is the conventional narrative. It is clean. It is logical. It fits the pattern of how other early civilizations developed. But it doesn't explain the Dynasty 0 tombs at Abydos. It does not explain why the earliest writing appears fully formed. It does not explain why the stone vessels found in pre-dynastic and early dynastic contexts at Abydos show a mastery of hard stone carving that, like the granite box in the king's chamber, like the serapeum boxes at Saqqara, implies capabilities that the standard model does not attribute to this period. It does not explain the 14 boats. and it does not explain the one discovery at Abydos that researchers find most difficult to incorporate into the standard narrative. The discovery of what appears to be a complete administrative infrastructure, storerooms, workshops, production facilities in the cemetery area at Abydos, predating the First Dynasty, implying that the organization of a complex state existed before the state itself was supposed to have formed, an infrastructure before the civilization it served, a writing system before the state that writing was supposed to serve, a mastery of stone and boat building before the cultural evolution that should have produced it. Abydos does not look like the beginning of Egyptian civilization. It looks like the continuation of something that already existed. The 14 boats raise a question that the symbolic explanation does not fully answer. If the boats were symbolic, placed to serve the pharaoh's afterlife journey, why were they built to such exact, functional specifications? But there is a second question that is even more significant. Where did the knowledge to build them come from? The boats found at Abydos are among the oldest watercraft ever discovered. They are not primitive. They are not the simple dugout canoes or reed rafts that represent the earliest stages of boat-building technology. They are plank-built vessels, constructed from separate pieces of wood, shaped and fitted together into a hull, with a structural sophistication that implies a long tradition of shipbuilding. A tradition that, in the archaeological record of Egypt, appears at Abydos essentially without precedent. There are no known earlier Egyptian boats. There is no known developmental sequence of Egyptian shipbuilding that leads up to the Abydos vessels. They appear, like the hieroglyphs in the Dynasty 0 tombs, essentially fully formed. Plank-built boats of this sophistication require knowledge of wood selection, wood shaping, structural engineering, and waterproofing that takes generations to develop and refine. The knowledge does not emerge spontaneously. It is transmitted from builders to apprentices across time through a tradition of practice that leaves traces in the archaeological record. The traces are not there. The boats are there. But the tradition that should have produced them is not. Once again, at Abydos, the sequence is reversed. The sophisticated product appears without the developmental process that should have preceded it, which suggests, again, that the process happened somewhere else, that the knowledge was brought to Abydos, not developed there, that whoever built the first boats buried at Abydos and carved the first hieroglyphs found at Abydos and constructed the stone vessels found in the earliest Abydos tombs, brought these capabilities with them from a source we have not found, a civilization before the civilization, a tradition before the tradition, a beginning before the beginning. There is a detail about the Abydos boat burials that connects them to everything else this series has been examining. The boats are oriented. Each one is positioned with its prow pointing north. North, toward the Mediterranean, toward the sea, toward the world beyond Egypt's borders. In Egyptian religious symbolism, north was not the primary sacred direction. East, the direction of the rising sun, the direction of resurrection and rebirth, was the most sacred orientation. West, the direction of the setting sun, the direction of death and the underworld, was where the dead were buried. The royal tombs at Abydos face east. The Osirion is oriented to specific astronomical alignments. The pyramids at Giza are oriented to the cardinal directions, with extraordinary precision. But the boats face north, toward the sea, as if whoever placed them there wanted them ready for a journey. Not a symbolic journey through the underworld, a physical journey, a departure. From where to where? The boats are 5,000 years old, and their wood has not been fully analyzed for the geographic origin of the timber. Some preliminary work suggests the wood species used may not be native to Egypt, that the lumber may have been imported, possibly from the Levant, possibly from further afield. If the wood came from outside Egypt, if the boats were built from imported materials, then whoever built them had connections to distant sources of supply. Trade networks, or political relationships, or the practical capacity to acquire materials from places that Egypt's early civilization was supposedly just beginning to reach. Again, a sophistication that appears before the developmental sequence that should have produced it. Again, the same question. Who were these people, and where did they come from? Abydos holds one more secret that this series cannot leave behind. In 2000, archaeologists working at Abydos discovered evidence of what appeared to be a previously unknown royal tomb complex from the earliest dynasties. A complex of underground galleries, storage chambers, and ritual spaces significantly larger than what had been previously mapped at el-Ka'ab. The discovery was announced cautiously. Preliminary reports suggested that the complex might belong to a ruler who predated even the Dynasty 0 kings, a figure so early in the sequence that his existence would push the formal beginning of Egyptian royal history back further than the conventional timeline allows. The excavation was ongoing. And then, in the familiar pattern of this series, the reports slowed. The excavation continued, but the results became less public. The preliminary findings were not followed up with the kind of comprehensive publication that would allow independent researchers to assess what had been found. The complex at Abydos is still being excavated. What it contains, whether it supports the preliminary reports of a ruler earlier than Dynasty 0, or whether the preliminary reports were overstated, is not publicly known in the detail that would be needed to settle the question. Another excavation, another set of findings that raise fundamental questions about the timeline of Egyptian civilization. Another investigation that produces preliminary results and then retreats from full public disclosure. The pattern holds. Even here, even at the place where history begins, even at Abydos, step back from the details and look at what Abydos, as a whole, is telling us. It is the oldest royal cemetery in Egypt, the place where the earliest kings were buried, the place where the first hieroglyphs appear, the place where the earliest evidence of a complex, organized Egyptian state has been found. And at every level of its archaeology, there is the same anomaly. The capabilities appear before the developmental process that should have produced them. The writing is fully formed before the evolutionary sequence that should precede it. The boat building is sophisticated before the tradition that should have developed it. The stoneworking mastery appears in the earliest levels before the gradual improvement that craft traditions show over time. The administrative infrastructure appears before the state it was supposed to serve. Either all of these anomalies have mundane explanations that have simply not yet been found. Developmental sequences that happened somewhere unexcavated, traditions transmitted from regions whose archaeology has not yet been studied. Or the capabilities were not developed in Egypt at all. They were brought there by people who already possessed them. From a civilization that had developed these skills over a long period, a period that predates the Egyptian record, that predates the archaeological sequence we have, that belongs to a chapter of human history that the evidence keeps pointing toward and that the official narrative keeps declining to acknowledge. A civilization that built at Giza and at Saqqara and at Abydos, that carved the Sphinx and machined the granite boxes and built the Osirian and buried 14 functional boats in the desert pointing north. That gave Egypt its writing system and its stone-working tradition and its religious cosmology and its oldest royal tombs. And then, as catastrophically and as completely as the civilization that Plato described sinking beneath the waves, vanished, leaving behind only the monuments and the mysteries, and the question that Abydos, more than any other site in this series, forces us to ask. Not what is hidden here, not who is preventing us from looking, but something more fundamental. Who were the people who started all of this? And what happened to them? The answer is somewhere in the sand at Abydos, beneath the tombs of the kings before the kings, beneath the boats that face north toward a sea they never sailed again, beneath the first words ever written in the language of ancient Egypt, appearing fully formed, as if from nowhere, as if transmitted from a source that the record does not show, and the history we have been taught does not acknowledge. The beginning is here, but it is not the beginning we were taught. It is the continuation of something older, something whose beginning we have not yet found, and whose end, if it ended, left traces so deep in the foundations of human civilization that we are still living inside them, without knowing it, without asking why, without following the evidence to where it has been pointing, across 12 videos and 4 countries and thousands of years of buried mystery, all the way back to the beginning, to Abydos, where history starts and where the story we thought we knew runs out of words. There is a final thread at Abydos that deserves its own moment. The name itself. Abydos is the Greek rendering of the ancient Egyptian name for the site, Abju. And Abju, in the oldest religious texts of ancient Egypt, is described not simply as a city or a cemetery. It is described as the place where the head of Osiris was buried. Not Osiris's whole body, his head. In the Egyptian myth of Osiris, the most important myth in the entire religious tradition of ancient Egypt, Osiris was murdered by his brother Set, who cut his body into 14 pieces and scattered them across Egypt. His wife and sister Isis gathered the pieces and reassembled them, restoring Osiris to life in the first act of resurrection. 14 pieces, and 14 boats buried in a row at Abydos. The number is the same. This may be coincidence. Numerological coincidences appear frequently when people look for them, and the human mind is remarkably good at finding patterns that are not there. But in a series that has repeatedly found the name of Osiris at the most significant and most anomalous sites in Egypt, the Serapeum, the Osirian, the tunnels of Giza, the temple of Osiris Magna, the appearance of his number at Abydos in the form of 14 boats, whose purpose no conventional explanation fully accounts for, is worth pausing on. 14 pieces of a god, scattered across the land. 14 boats, buried in the desert, pointing north. A myth that is also a map, or a map that was also a myth, in a place that is both the beginning of history and the location of something that predates history, at Abydos, where Osiris's head is buried, where the kings before the kings were laid to rest, where the first words were written, where 14 boats wait in the sand, pointing toward a sea that the civilization that buried them may have come from. The myth says Osiris was reassembled, restored, resurrected. Maybe the pieces are still being gathered. Maybe the 14 boats are waiting for the journey home. Maybe the history that begins at Abydos is not the beginning at all, but the continuation of a story that started somewhere else, somewhere that the sand has not yet given up, somewhere that the sealed doors of this series have been pointing toward. One door at a time, one mystery at a time, one step closer to the beginning that we have not yet found, that Abydos has been keeping for us, in the desert, in the dark, at the place where history starts and where the real story is still waiting to be told.